In this video, I'll explain a bit about metallic materials and how they're different from everything else. So, the first thing you need to know is that metals are generally quite reflective. In fact, clean, pure metals like high quality gold and silver are pretty much completely glossy and don't have any diffuse at all. But in reality, everything has a little bit of something else as well, like rust, oil, dirt, and grime. And the more common substances, like steel and the aluminium that we can buy in the shops, are actually alloys, meaning they're mixed with a few other elements like carbon and chromium. Secondly, the glossy component of metals is quite often colored, as opposed to non-metals where it's usually just white. A lot of the time, this is the reason why people say your metals look like plastic. So, as a rule of thumb, when we're making non-metallic materials, we should start with the diffuse and add a bit of glossy later, and then when we're making metallic materials, we start with the glossy and then add the diffuse. So let's take a look at our ninja's sword. It's probably some kind of steel, so it's going to have a little bit of a brushed pattern from how he's polished it over the years, and it's also going to have a bit of a wavy shape along the middle from where they created the sword, where they mixed the two metals together and hammered them and fused them together and that sort of thing. So let's take a look at our Blender internal file, and you can see there's a couple different textures here. We've got a metal ref, which is the accessories diffuse, and that's kind of affecting a whole bunch of different things, but we don't really want to worry about that now. We're going to make this metal from scratch. Then the other texture we've got is that wavy pattern I was talking about, and then we've got a reflection falloff, which is our Fresnel, and a reflection fake, which is just to speed up the render time, and we don't really need to bother with that because reflections in cycles are pretty darn quick. So, let's go ahead and make sure our material is using some nodes, go into local view, and let's start rendering and see what happens. Maybe I'll just switch to GPU to make it a little bit quicker. Alright, so, and of course, path tracing. Alright, okay, now let's start. Let's go ahead and swap this diffuse shader with a glossy shader, and we're going to start with our shape up over here, which is just the handle, and this is going to be a very simple material, it doesn't have any textures on it. Now as you can see, the default distribution for the glossy shaders, as of 2.71 I think, is now GGX, which is great for plastics and skin and things, but for metals, Beckman is usually quite a bit nicer, so let's try that. And you can see it makes it quite a bit darker, and the reflection is a little bit sharper. Not really sharper, but the shape of the reflection is not quite as spread out. So that's kind of good. And as you can see, this already looks quite a bit like metal. Maybe we can reduce the roughness a little bit to 0.1 or so, and that looks pretty good. The reason most people screw up with gold and gold shaders, stuff that's supposed to look like a colored metal, is because they usually start with giving their diffuse a color and then trying to make the glossy kind of make it shiny, which is the wrong way to go about it. It's better to start with the glossy and then add the diffuse. And I think as a pretty basic shader, this is pretty good. Let's add a little bit of diffuse in it. Maybe it's got some dust and grime and oil and stuff on it, so let's go ahead and add our layer weight, which will be our Fresnel, and then the diffuse shader. Now, because of the way Fresnel works, it's lighter on the edge, we're always going to want to put the diffuse in the top input and the glossy in the bottom. That way, our control over here is pretty accurate. Okay, so let's go and connect the Fresnel into the FAC, and maybe make the blend somewhere around 0.9, and of course make the diffuse the same gold color. And I think that looks pretty good. It's got a little bit of diffuse in it, maybe a little bit too much. We can make that 0.95. We just want it to feel like there's some kind of layer of dust. We don't really want it to look diffuse. Otherwise it won't look too much like metal, it'll be too flat. So that's it for the handle. It's very easy. So now we're going to do pretty much the same thing. So I'm going to select all of these nodes, Control C to copy them, go to our sword, make sure that's using nodes, and Control V to paste, which is pretty cool. And now of course that looks like gold. We don't want it to be gold, we want it to be silver. So let's just change this white to no saturation. There we go. Copy paste. And that's pretty cool. Let's go ahead and add our textures. Now the first texture is going to be that wavy pattern, which I believe is called, I don't actually know what it's called, sword grain. There we go. So let's look for sword grain, there it is. And if we just Control Shift click that, you can see what it's going to look like. And that's not what we want. And the reason for that is, again, because it's using the wrong UV map. We're actually not going to use this metal UV map, so we can just set the default UV map to the where one. So that's going to fix itself right there, and we don't have to bother with the UV map node. Okay. So what we want to use this for is to control the roughness of the glossy shader. So as you can see, the glossy on point, let's just make it 0.03, is going to be, it's not that sharp, it's quite rough. And we want to make it so that the front edge of this blade, the side that decapitates people the most, is a little bit less rough. It's been polished a little more thoroughly. So that's going to be 0.03, and then the back side of the blade is going to be 0.06, I think. So how we're going to do that is just by adding a color ramp, which is going to let us remap, remap this black and white to a specific color. So like I said, the black will be 0.06 and the white will be 0.03. Now of course it doesn't look like anything here, but those are values that the glossy shader can use in the roughness. But now that we plug it in, it kind of looks a lot sharper than when it's not plugged in. Even though this is 0.06 and our darkest value, or the lightest value in fact, is 0.06 as well, it shouldn't look like that. It should be a lot more rough. And the reason for that is because of gamma correction. And I think recently, it might not even be the official 2.71, it might be only coming out in 2.72. And that's because I've got a development build from a different date, is because we need to add a gamma correction node. Not that one. Gamma, there we go. And put that on 0.45. Now the reason for this is to do with color spaces and how our computers display values to us, and it's pretty complicated. I suggest you do quite a bit of research into it. It could take you days to go through everything. So just for now, remember that this has got to be around 0.45. If you want to be exact, you can just make it 1 divided by 2.2. So it's going to be 0.45555 or something like that. And then you can see that's working nicely. It looks a lot more like that. So I don't really think that this the wavy pattern is quite visible enough. So I'm just going to go and change that 0.06, or rather the 0.03, to something lower like 0.01. And now you can sort of start to see that wavy pattern a little bit. Not too obvious, but it's there. And then I want to use that same wavy pattern to make the backside of the blade slightly darker instead of just white. So let's go and Control-Shift-D that node. And that's not working for some reason, something to do with the screen recording. So let's just duplicate that and connect it manually. And then we can change this. Let's just make it back to white and plug it in and see what it looks like. It's going to be way too dark, so rather than just black, we'll make it something slightly less than white. And there we go. And by the way, that gamma correction is also the reason why the value over here is 0.73, but the actual RGB values are around 0.5. It's kind of strange, but that's how it works these days. Okay, so that's looking quite a bit nicer. We can actually notice that wavy pattern now. Maybe it's slightly too strong. Let's increase that. Alright, so now let's go ahead and add that other texture. And that other texture is going to be the accessories diffuse. And this is what's going to give us that sort of brushed metal look from how he's polished the blade over the years. And how we're going to use this is by kind of controlling that layer weight node over here. So the blend is going to be 0.95, but we kind of want to get it somewhere around there. So maybe we can mix it between maybe 0.85 and 1. So let's go ahead and add our color ramp. Make it 0.85 and 1. I think that's on 1 already, yep. And again, we're going to need that gamma node because we want to use exact values and not just the general color. And we can plug that in there. And I think that's a little bit too diffuse, so let's go and increase this value to, not that one, this guy over here. This guy to 0.95 maybe. And yeah, that looks quite a bit better. Okay, and then we're going to use the same texture for the bump map. So we can just go ahead and connect that color to the displacement and add our math node, which is going to be on multiply, and then that is going to be the strength factor for the bump map. And let's just try 0.01, zoom in a little bit, and you can see that it is actually taking effect. Maybe I'll just invert this by making it negative, and I think that's pretty good. Maybe negative 0.02. Alright, you don't want to make it too strong, but I think that's okay. So that is our sword material done. In the next video, we're going to do the cloth material, and I'll try to explain a little bit about diffuse roughness and roughness in general.